Policy talk. So instead of presenting some actual research results, I would like to introduce you with some key policy options and policy directions with the hope to stimulate a reflection and a lively discussion after my talk. And I will talk today about an emerging issue when we consider the human responses to climate change, which is the issue of population resettlement in anticipation of climate impacts. Most of the research that I do, as Chuck just reminded, is related to the people being displaced by the impacts of climate change. This type of migration is a little bit different because this time it's not the people who decide to move, but it is actually governments who decide to move people in anticipation of climate impacts. As you can imagine, this type of policy is extremely contentious, extremely controversial, and I would like to highlight today some of the challenges, some of the stakes, and some of the controversies that surround these policies, and I hope that we can exchange on these challenges afterward. I want to start with a small introduction, which is actually related to a case that happened in my country about 5 years ago in Vendée, which is on the west coast of France. So in March 2010, a bit more than 5 years ago, a violent storm hit the region of Vendée. And the death toll of the disaster surprised most observers. 53 people perished, most of them in the flooding of two small coastal towns, La Faute-sur-Mer and l'Aiguillon-sur-Mer. So 53 deaths, that's a really surprisingly high death toll for a country like France. And understandably, there was a major shock and major outcry at the death toll of the disaster. So shortly after the disaster, the government established so-called black zones in the region. And these black zones were actually the zones that houses had been flooded. And these zones were deemed no longer suitable for inhabitation. And therefore the French government decided to resettle the people currently living in these black zones, including large parts of La Faute-sur-Mer and l'Aiguillon-sur-Mer. And you can see the extent of the flooding here, and the visits from President Nicolas Sarkozy and Minister for the Environment Jean-Louis Borloo at that time. So therefore, the government decided to go ahead with a resettlement scheme related to the black zone. And under the resettlement scheme, the people could choose where to relocate, and they would receive a compensation, the actual market value of the house before the flood. The scheme and the package offered to the people was thought at this time incredibly generous. And the decision to resettle these people was met with approbation from most risk assessment experts. The problem is that the decision was also met with outrage from the communities of these two small towns. The people protested, they demonstrated, and they rebelled. So on these walls you can read, on the top left corner, they would like to come back. Here used to live a couple, a small boy and a small girl. On the top right corner, Cynthia, that's the name of the storm, has shocked us, and now the state is trying to bury us. And then on the bottom image, Mr. President Sarkozy, there are other solutions that just destroy our houses. Please hear us. So the people obviously did not agree with the resettlement scheme. The people rebelled, and they were supported in their protest by the local authorities who refused to implement the government's decisions. The decision was widely seen as a bureaucrat's lunacy with no consideration of the people's feelings. The government was forced to move backwards, and the resettlement scheme was abandoned. Yet what is particular about this resettlement scheme is that many people would have made a considerable financial benefit if they had agreed to the scheme. Their house would have been repaid in full at the market price before the flood, even though some of the houses had been completely destroyed and the real estate market had plummeted after the disaster. But despite these highly favorable financial conditions, most refused to go. Another particularity is that most of the houses targeted by the resettlement scheme were not primary residences, but holiday homes. One could hardly speak of a community. 45% of the houses in La Faute-sur-Mer and a staggering 86% of the houses in L'Aiguillon-sur-Mer were secondary residences that people used to spend some of their weekends and holidays. Most of these houses belonged to bourgeois from Paris. And yet, despite all of this, the people were so attached to the place that they refused to go, preferring to stay in places that are, by all accounts, likely to be flooded again, resulting in more deaths and devastation. So as you can see, the government was forced to back down, the environment minister was close to resigning. The problem, of course, is that in developing countries, many regions are much more exposed to the impacts of climate change than Vendée. And these regions are also much more populated, with people forming communities that have sometimes inhabited there for centuries. They are not holiday towns made up of secondary homes. And most likely, their governments will not be able to afford to compensate for houses or land at full market price, and yet, resettlement will be on the agenda at one point or another. And this is the reason why we need to have this conversation, not just because of the people in Vendée, but because such resettlement schemes are now taking place all over the world. And you can see some examples on this map. There are many, many, many others, and many more to come. And we need to have this conversation because although I still would like to believe that we will manage to keep global average temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, as most of you, I guess, there is no compelling evidence that we will not manage to cut global greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2050. That's in 35 years, and reduction by half is what we would need to do if we want to stand a decent chance, 50-50, of limiting global average temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And therefore, in the unlikely event that governments respect their current and yet non-binding pledge of emission reductions, the global average temperature increase would still amount to about 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. As you know, the year 2014 was the hottest year on record. In 2014, we emitted globally about 40 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. Therefore, by all accounts, we are not on the right track to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by the middle of the century. And of course, we need to do everything we can to prevent this from happening. But at the same time, we need to face reality and accept that a world at plus 4 degrees Celsius is no longer an improbable doom and gloom scenario. Such a temperature increase would of course result in major environmental changes affecting widely populated regions. At the moment, there are too many people who live in regions that are highly exposed to the impacts of climate change. And for the better or the worse, governments will thus consider the issue of resettlement. And in a number of cases, as shown on this map, it is already considered or underway. And if we look at the way climate change will have an impact on people displacement, we can distinguish between primary, secondary, and tertiary impacts on displacement. The primary impact is when climate change itself will induce displacement because of typhoons, because of sea level rise, because of floods, or because of droughts. And these impacts will result themselves in displacement. Then we can identify a secondary impact of climate change when the responses to climate change, the infrastructure that will be built in response to climate change, will induce displacement. That's the case of that, for example. And then there is a tertiary impact, which is the one I will focus on today, which is the displacement in anticipation of climate impacts. The displacement decided and organized by governments, that is resettlement. So there are clearly two types of relocation or resettlement processes related to climate change. Those that are related to mitigation and adaptation projects, such as dams, or biofuel forest plantations, irrigation schemes, dikes, and so on and so forth. And those that are conducted in anticipation of climate impacts. And I will focus on the latter. I have to say that in the academic community, this is still a very contentious issue. And the question is, shall we get ready for this discussion? Shall we discuss resettlement in anticipation of climate impacts at this stage? Or is it a political no-go? You might remember that very early on in the climate negotiations, the discussion on adaptation was a political no-go. Environmentalists, climate scientists, all agreed that we should not discuss about adaptation because that would give a handy excuse to governments to delay their mitigation efforts, not to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. But in the early 2000s, the impacts of climate change were so obvious that obviously there was a need to discuss about adaptation. And adaptation was no longer considered as an excuse that governments could use not to mitigate. Adaptation was no longer considered as something that would clash with mitigation, but as something that should go hand in hand with mitigation. In a way, we are now in the same kind of discussion right now with resettlement, with some saying we should not discuss about resettlement because this is going to give a good excuse to governments not to do anything with regard to adaptation. Why the need to develop adaptation strategies, to develop adaptation infrastructure, if we can just move people to another place? Where others are saying, well, these resettlement schemes will take place anyway, whatever we do, and therefore we need to get ready for them to make sure that they are conducted the right way and that we minimize the human rights impacts of the schemes. I'm rather an advocate of the latter, but you will find colleagues and other members of the academic community saying that it is too early to discuss about resettlement and that there is a risk indeed to give an excuse to government not to deploy significant adaptation strategies, and we need to be aware of this risk. When we published, for example, this piece in Science back in 2011, we were faced with harsh comments and criticism from academic colleagues stating that this piece came way too early and that clearly we were not ready for the discussion yet. And indeed, there are a few things that you need to consider before you take the decision to move people. And indeed, before we come to the issue of resettlement, we need to ask ourselves the question, why do so many people live in regions that are so dangerous, that are so exposed to the impacts of climate change? And of course, the answer to this question will often be different in the north and in the south. In developing countries, it is often because that was the only land that was available or affordable to poor and marginalized communities. Or because this is where the work opportunities were located. In both cases, it pertains to the responsibility of the government. Governments, indeed, can influence where people settle. After all, it's all about the economy, stupid. And governments have a responsibility to make sure that people settle in safe areas. And this means that they should take more responsibility for the spatial planning of the economy. And when resettlement is considered, as many have pointed out, the human rights of the resettled populations should be paramount. I will not elaborate on this point, but the rights pertaining to housing, land and property appear as particularly important, and are also the key condition of a smooth integration with the host community. Electoral rights, in particular, are often neglected, and yet the political participation and representation of resettled communities need to be guaranteed. And I want to illustrate through 3 quick case studies why these human rights are often at risk and in jeopardy in resettlement scheme. The first resettlement scheme I want to discuss takes place in Inner Mongolia, in the north of China. This is a province of China that is a threat of desertification, and the desert is clearly claiming more and more land every day, to the point that authorities in Beijing are now concerned that the Gobi Desert might soon reach the suburbs of Beijing. It is also a region that used to be inhabited by nomadic pastoralists, and that has grown, that has known, a rapid demographic increase from 5 million people in the 1950s to about 25 million in the 2000s. So this is a region that has been settled by the Han Chinese, the majority ethnic group in China, to the point that the ethnic Mongols, the original inhabitants of the place, now represent only about 13% of the population in the province. The problem, of course, is that China is quickly losing land to the desert, about 4,000 square kilometers per year, and that the reforestation programs have not been very successful so far. You can see that progress and success has been quite limited with the reforestation programs. And therefore the Chinese government has decided in the early 2000s to launch a program called Ecological Relocation. The goal of this program is to resettle Mongol nomadic pastoralists in villages and small towns. Over the last decade, a bit less than 700,000 people have been resettled this way, with small compensations offered in exchange of the closing of the grasslands. The reason why nomadic pastoralists were resettled is because the government identified them as the primary responsible for the desertification process because of the overgrazing problem. And therefore they decided to close the grassland and to resettle people in small towns and villages. This implied for them a radical change of lifestyle. They used to be nomadic pastoralists. They have now become sedentary farmers, with only a very small compensation, and of course, no consultation about what they wanted to do and where they wanted to go. Even though this is not obviously admitted by the Chinese government, we cannot help but think that there might be some political objectives behind the resettlement scheme as well. Inner Mongolia is an autonomous region of China with secessionist views as well, and therefore resettling a minority ethnic group in small towns and villages inhabited by the majority ethnic group is also a way for the Chinese government to annihilate these secessionist views and ambitions. So, desertification might also come as a handy excuse for the Chinese government to achieve these political objectives. And you can see here some pictures of these nomadic pastoralists now living in small farms in a sedentary way. The second case is, of course, very well known. It is the case of the Three Gorges Dam, also in China. It is one of the largest resettlement schemes ever, with more than 1.3 million people displaced as a result of the construction of the dam. One thing that we often forget is that the dam was built primarily as a response to environmental disruption. The primary goal of the building of the dam was to prevent the region against flood. the irony is that the construction of the dam itself resulted in major flooding of the whole region. It is also probably the only engineering project in the world that costs less than planned, and it has now become in China a major touristic attraction. 1.3 million people were resettled, and they were resettled in very diverse conditions. Some got quite lucky in the process and were fully compensated for the loss of their home and of their land, but some didn't get as lucky as the former. And the primary reason for that is that the people who were living in the flooded zone got properly resettled, but the other one, those whose house was not directly affected, but whose livelihood depended on the region, depended on the others, were not considered under the resettlement scheme, and therefore were forced to move as well. We can only understand this resettlement scheme in the context of the increasing urbanization of China. And many of the resettled people we met with knew that they would have to move to the city at one point or another in their lifetime, and some actually took advantage of the resettlement scheme that was offered by the government to move to the city with a proper financial compensation. Finally, I wanted to highlight the case of a small island state, the Taku Atoll in Papua New Guinea. The Taku Atoll is threatened by sea level rise. And as a result, the government of Papua New Guinea has decided to resettle the whole atoll on the island of Bougainville. This is the island that you see over there. So far, the resettlement process has proved extremely difficult. A key difficulty is that the autonomous province of Bougainville would like to become independent from Papua New Guinea. And therefore, it is extremely difficult to implement a resettlement program from Port Moresby, from the central government, in a region that seeks to become independent, and therefore that is unlikely to apply and implement the plans of the central government. But another problem of the resettlement scheme is the social problem that it induces. Some people on Taku are very willing to resettle. Some people think that they will get better land, better opportunities in Bougainville, and therefore they've signed up for the resettlement scheme. Some have actually went on an exploratory mission to recognize the land, and they decided to stay, and they never came back to their families on the atoll. In a same family, some are willing to go, others are willing to stay. And therefore, right now at the moment, and even though it has not been properly started yet, the resettlement program is already inducing major social dislocations amongst communities and amongst families. Those who want to stay are feeling abandoned by those who want to go. Those who want to go consider that those who want to stay are stupid for wanting to stay. And we see already huge social problems, social dislocations in relation to this resettlement scheme. Because, of course, what the third case study illustrates is the right not to be displaced. And indeed, it seems to me that even when a resettlement scheme is considered, that the people should also have the right to stay. That is, the right not to be resettled. And if resettlement is conducted in the right way, with proper consultation, compensation and improvement of the livelihoods, then it should appear as an attractive option for those living in vulnerable areas. But we also need to recognize the right of those who want to stay to do so, even if the resettlement is conducted in a proper way, even if the majority of the community agrees to be resettled. Because there might be cultural, family or personal circumstances that make resettlement an unattractive option, or because people simply don't always act rationally. Not only should these people have the right to stay, but the government has a responsibility to protect them, which includes a duty to assist them with the environmental change, and possibly when a disaster occurs. Those who decide to stay should not be abandoned by the governments. The problem is, I am a political scientist, and if there is one thing that my studies have taught me, it is that governments should not be trusted. That is not to say that governments are evil, simply that they have different and conflicting agendas, elections coming up, economic interests, etc. And amongst these conflicting agendas, the interests of vulnerable communities are unlikely to come first. Because first, indeed, environmental hazards might come as a handy excuse for governments seeking to displace populations for political reasons. Such reasons can include the dislocation of ethnic minority groups, gerrymandering, or economic planning. Thus, resettlement processes need to be carefully monitored. Second, and probably more importantly, developing countries should not be the only ones supporting the costly burden of resettlement. They bear very little responsibility for climate impacts, and they need to be assisted by developed countries. This assistance needs to be financial at first, but it can also take the form of the provision of migration opportunities. So resettlement processes have been almost exclusively intranational so far. International migration routes could also be expanded, which would allow for the possibility of international resettlement. Overall, my point is that resettlement associated with climate change should not be addressed only on a national level, but needs to be considered globally, because it is a matter of justice, but also because it could offer new opportunities. And in the long term, this discussion should just not be about governments resettling some communities, but about the geographical distribution of the population in a world at +4 degrees Celsius with 9 billion people. There are also strong ethical issues that are associated with resettlement in anticipation of climate impacts. I'm sure many of you have seen this movie by Steven Spielberg, Minority Report. It tells the story of a special unit in a futuristic police. And this unit has the power to foresee crime before they are committed. Which means that police officers in this unit have also the possibility to arrest people before they commit a crime, simply because they know and they've foreseen that they would commit a crime in the future. Of course, there are two ways to see this. Some could say, well, it's a rational thing to do. We should arrest people before they commit a crime so that nobody gets hurt, so that the crime is not committed. Others are saying it is simply wrong from an ethical perspective to arrest people for a crime that they've not committed yet. And of course, Tom Cruise, as the lead character in the movie, is a police officer confronted with this dilemma. Is it okay to arrest people before he or she commits a crime? And what if you got the information wrong? What if there was a minority report indicating that this person, at the end of the day, will not commit the crime that you think she or he will commit? We can apply a similar reasoning to resettlement in anticipation of climate impacts. At the moment, the Vietnamese government is conducting a wide-ranging resettlement program in the Mekong Delta called Living with Floods. The purpose of the scheme is to avoid that these villages in the Mekong Delta would get flooded one day or another because of sea level rise and the associated floods. So far, the program has induced mostly social and economic dislocation, poverty, and human rights violation. But some might say, well, you know, it's still better than being the victim of a flood. It's still better than a humanitarian disaster at the end of the day. But some are also saying, well, you know, what if we got it wrong? What if there was a way to protect the Mekong Delta? What if there was a way to build dikes so that these communities wouldn't have to be resettled? Or simply, in other cases, what if the climate prediction was wrong? As you know, in the current state of climate modeling, we've made major progress with regard to global modeling, but I would say that local and regional modeling is still much progress to do, and in the current state of science, it is extremely difficult to foresee and predict an impact of climate change at the very local level. Yet, this is, of course, the very local level that matters in this case. A second ethical issue is, for how long should the resettlement last after a disaster? And I want here to illustrate this with a case not related to climate change, but raising still very important questions. One of the latest research that I conducted was related to the people displaced by the Fukushima disaster in Japan. And of course, many communities were resettled by the Japanese government because they were living in highly contaminated zones by radioactivity. And when they were initially resettled, these people thought that that was a temporary resettlement, that at some point in time they would be able to come back to their home, to their land, to their village. The problem is that, of course, radioactivity levels remain very high and are unlikely to decrease significantly in the next 30 or 40 years. Which means that the people are still living in a state of limbo where they hope that one day they will be able to get back to their land or their home, but that many of them are coming to the point when they realize that this resettlement scheme is likely to be a permanent displacement rather than a temporary evacuation. Yet it is common that government would evacuate and would resettle people in anticipation of a disaster or in the aftermath of a disaster. The question is, for how long should these resettlements last? And to what extent is a resettlement temporary or permanent? This is another ethical question that we will need to face. My final point is about the next generations. And I would say that a key reason for the failure of previous resettlement processes, including the one attempted in Vendée, is that they were imposed on people and conducted over relatively short periods of time. In other words, they were brutal processes rather than incremental transformations. This doesn't have to be the case with climate change. A great injustice of climate change is that future generations will suffer because of the carbon emissions of their parents and grandparents. Our chance, however, is that these generations are not born yet, which gives us a little bit of time to plan ahead. Resettlement could indeed span over 2 or 3 generations. People don't have to be uprooted. Instead, they could be encouraged to settle in safer areas from the start. Providing new job opportunities and new places to settle would allow for relocation to be chosen by the people themselves as the rational course of action. Resettlement would no longer be an imposed decision, but rather a choice made by the people themselves in order to secure more sustainable livelihoods. Progress has often been defined as a certainty that our children would live a better life than we do. And climate change has been a key factor that has called this certainty into question. spanning resettlement processes over several generations, could indeed restore the hope that some children could lead a better life than their parents. Thank you. Now I think we have time for questions and answers, so I'll start with you, sir.
Yeah, so it's a very most interesting presentation. I'm a little bothered by a whole bunch of things. Actually, a lot more.
Tell me.
So, first, I heard no discussion of the history of climate change as the #1 cause of war throughout history, as resources become depleted. I heard no discussion of how politically and economically induced migrations have historically occurred, often by manipulation of leaders of one group or another, or of religious values and belief sets that have driven people, nor of distributed responsibility. When one talks about zones that are prone to flooding, there are alternatives such as stilt construction, but more importantly, any single decision imposes a potential burden on the body elected. So this is just a start, but and I guess without trying to take the whole story, lastly is the acceptance of the local population through the introduction of new immigrants, for which there is very little and rather modest historic basis. In other words, if you're going to relocate hundreds of thousands of people, it is unlikely that the location that they'll be redistributed to is going to be very accepting for all kinds of behavioral reasons. So let me stop there. But behavioral economic basis don't seem to be included here. Where I hear a lot of normative decisions that I personally consider not realistic.
All right, thank you. Well, your questions span actually way beyond the very topic of the talk and address migration related to climate change in general. But let me try and address some of the points that you raised. First, about the relationship between climate change, or let's say climate variability, and war and tensions. Well, there is no denying that there is a strong correlation between climate variability and the occurrence of social tensions and wars and conflicts. I would say where there is still quite a lot of discussion in the academic community is about the theoretical models that correlate these climate variations and wars and conflicts. Indeed, correlation does not mean causality, and there is still a wide debate in the academic community about whether we can derive causality from this correlation. This being said, there is no denying that there is a significant risk of conflict of war associated with climate change. The reason why Al Gore and IPCC got awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2007 rather than the Nobel Prize for Physics was indeed an acknowledgement and a recognition that the fight against climate change was also a fight for the stability and the security of the world. And indeed, war and conflicts, as we all know, are major drivers of migration. What seems extremely significant to me at this point is that according to the latest figures released by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva, there are now more people displaced by natural disasters than by war and violence. If I take only the statistics for 2030, we don't have the data for 2014 yet, if I take the statistics for 2030, there were about 3 times more people displaced by natural disasters than people displaced by war and violence, despite the conflicts in Afghanistan, in Central African Republic, in Iraq, and in Syria and Libya. So that is to say that indeed climate change, or rather environmental disruptions, have now become the major factor of displacement and migration worldwide. And this is something that has not yet been fully taken into account by policymakers. These people don't have any kind of international status. There is no international agency mandated to assist and protect these people. So definitely we have a huge, huge issue on our hands. You mentioned the manipulation of leaders, of political or religious leaders. Clearly, migration also happens because of that. One of the really first historical examples of migration in history, the great Exodus led by Moses, is in a way a migration led by a religious leader. And this has happened many times. And I would say that this is an area of research where I feel more research is badly needed, is about the linkages between climate change and ethnic or religious or political radicalism. So far, there is, I would say, a real lack of research on these connections at the moment, and that seems to me like a priority area where social science could indeed invest their time and energy. There is no question that we are faced also with a matter of distributive responsibility, and that this is one of the reasons why I advocate for a global take on these resettlement decisions rather than just a national decision, because on the national level these decisions are very often imposed in a normative way to the people. I would say that bringing this discussion onto a global level would allow this discussion over a distributional responsibility. And indeed, the acceptance of the host community is absolutely crucial. To give you just one example, and one of the challenges that often appears with resettlement is that typically the resettled populations receive a financial package to assist them with the resettlement, including sometimes a new house, a new land. And the host community is really often a poor, marginalized community that is not entitled to the same package. So all of a sudden, they see these new immigrants with a significant financial package, and they, the host community, receive no assistance, and therefore they can feel also disadvantaged by this. And very often, and I would say, in the wider discussion on climate change and migration, and when we now consider migration as a possible adaptation strategy, as it is the case in the current climate negotiations, too little consideration is given to the host community. And very often the host community will be located in a city in the global south. I just want to take one example to illustrate this challenge, taken from the United States at the time of Hurricane Katrina. At the time of Hurricane Katrina, 10 years ago, about 250,000 people fled Louisiana and settled in Houston, Texas. They were initially greeted and welcomed with a warm hospitality from the people of Houston, and many families hosted evacuees in their living rooms. Some supermarkets closed the doors for a few days. Teachers accepted additional kids in their schools. But then after a couple of weeks, it became quite evident that these people from Louisiana would not be able to return to New Orleans or to the area nearby anytime soon, and that they were there to stay, at least for a few months. And soon enough, the hosting capacities of the city of Houston, which is the fourth largest city in the US and certainly one of the richest, were overwhelmed, simply because Houston was not able to take in an additional 250,000 people. So there were issues of housing, of schooling of the kids, of criminality, of unemployment, of crime and drugs, and of racism, to the point that after 3 months, the people of Houston staged a demonstration in front of the city hall to request the mayor of Houston to send these people back home in Louisiana. So if a city like Houston was unable to accommodate an additional 250,000 people for a few months, you can imagine the challenges for the host communities in the global metropolis of the global south. And indeed, more attention is to be given to the host communities and to these mega cities. Yes, sir?
I have a quick question and a cynical comment.
Start with a cynical comment.
No, follow the question. How does the willingness to be resettled varies with age? Because I was very struck by your French example, thinking, well, mostly if it's little bourgeois from Paris, who bought a secondary residence there years ago, presumably they're not going to be convinced they want to move from there because they know the return period of storming is very unlikely. And then if indeed old people are less likely to be resettled, then what would be a good incentive for government to try to move old people, because it seems it can only get unpopular?
Well, we observe, as, and this will not surprise you, I guess, a very strong correlation between age and the willingness to be resettled. So the older you get, the less likely you are to be willing to be resettled. Yet, this is not an automatic correlation, and depending on the local context, the correlation can take many forms, and sometimes, depending on the attachment to the land, depending on the financial package, depending on the consultation, this correlation can change. So, there is this general correlation, but the correlation can be mediated by a lot of local factors, including policy factors related to the way the resettlement process is conducted. You had a cynical comment?
Oh yeah, what's an incentive for government to try to move old people then?
Well, I guess the incentive, at least in the case, in the French case, was that there was a clear indication that such a storm was likely to happen in the coming years. Again, and that obviously there would be another humanitarian disaster, and obviously our lives would be lost, and that was clearly the incentive.
Are there any examples where host communities have been provided with incentives or resources in some way to handle the various challenges that obviously occur?
Yes, very few though. In Mauritius, for example, a community benefited immensely because of its willingness to accept the resettlement from a village. So a lot of major public infrastructures were built, and hospitals and roads. I would say that the way that a host community can benefit from the resettlement of another population, if it increases the size of the community significantly to justify the provision of additional public services like roads, hospitals, and that sort of things. And I would say this is in this case that the host community can really benefit from the intake of additional population. For example, the small territory of Tokelau in the South Pacific Ocean is currently trying to attract people from neighboring islands and to actually proposes resettlement schemes to them, because the New Zealand government has threatened Tokelau to close down some public services because there was just not enough population to justify them in Tokelau, and Tokelau is a New Zealand protectorate.
In the case of Inner Mongolia, was the cultural differences between the pastoralists and the cities or towns in which they were resettled very significant?
Yes, very significant. I mean, the pastoralists were ethnic Mongols, whereas the people living in towns and cities were Han Chinese, for the majority ethnic group. So yes, there was a whole wall of difference, alien. Yes, ma'am.
There are examples, Longterm and Holland, and in New York City, Mayor Bloomberg was there, and in Venice, to construct engineering solutions to flooding. Even before climate change was commonly discussed. Can you comment on that?
Of course. Well, the efforts that you mentioned in the Netherlands were actually undertaken in the early 1950s after the major floods that the country suffered in that decade, and certainly in Venice, the issue has been on the agenda for decades, and also in New York. There are indeed engineering solutions. It is very well possible, to build dikes or even artificial islands, like in Dubai, for example. So this is a possibility. But there are two problems with these engineering solutions. The problem, number one, is a problem of money. Sure, the Netherlands or New York or Venice will have the possibility to fund these engineering solutions, but what about Bangladesh or the Philippines? Will it be possible to protect the whole coast of Bangladesh or the whole islands of the Philippines the way that the Netherlands or New York have protected themselves? I'm afraid that some choices will need to be made about which territories to protect, and which territories to sacrifice. That's the number one issue. The second issue, which is especially important for islands, is the social issue. In the Maldives, about 10 years ago under the government Nasheed, it was decided to conduct what they called a safe island policy. That is to build artificial islands, and these islands were actually built by Dutch engineers, that would be resilient to sea level rise and to slowly resettle the population from the Maldivian islands to these artificial islands. The problem is that the people were unwilling to go and were unwilling to leave their island because in the Maldivian culture, the island is an extension of the self. It means that the territory you live on is part of yourself. And for them, moving from their island to another artificial island was like a little death, in a way. It was like killing a part of their self. And therefore there was a major social issue. And I would say the solution of building artificial islands, and sometimes people tell me, why don't we build artificial islands in the South Pacific Ocean? Because you need to understand that the island is part of the self of the population, so that for them, if they have to leave their island, then they might rather go to Australia or to New Zealand or to Hawaii rather than onto another artificial island that would mean nothing for them. Yes, sir.
I think there's a problem with the definition of climate change. That is to say, long term, 40, 50 years or something like that. It's hard to really put your finger on that and to justify that as a basis for population change. However, there are short-term, major climate changes such as the tsunamis or thunderstorms or whatever. And there you do have a basis for people having to change. And then the question is, the receptive countries that are there to accept people, how do they consider that versus political basis for climate change, which, or I'm sorry, political basis for migration change, which is more obvious to me.
Absolutely. I mean, this issue of the different timescales is indeed crucial.
Yes.
When the population are fleeing a major disaster, it's usually considered as a matter of hospitality and as a matter of humanity to welcome these people and to provide assistance. When you need to plan ahead for 40 or 50 years for changes that could happen in 40 or 50 years, well, it's a whole other story, because of course the acceptance is less important, because the risks and the uncertainties are also way more important. And it is a dilemma, for example, in small island states. Small island states like Tuvalu or Kiribati know that basically they're under serious threat because of sea level rise, but they also know that this will not happen before 40 or 50 or 60 years. So what is the rationale for planning now for an impact that might only happen in a few generations? Some might say, well, if you want to minimize the human impacts, it is rational to start planning now for these really long-term impacts. But others are saying, well, what is the point of imposing such a burden on the present generation for something that they will not possibly experience in their lifetime? And I would say that there is very much an ethical issue of the distribution over several generations here, but which generation has to do the effort of preparing for these long-term changes. This is one of the reasons why I advocate that these efforts should span over several generations, because it seems unfair to me that one generation should take the whole burden of these long-term adaptation planning. Yes, sir.
If we take the recent storm Sandy, and look a little bit of history. So first of all, a lot of that land had never been occupied until realtors convinced state officials to declare it as habitable. So there was a political decision, economic decision, that was then reinforced by the opportunity of being seaside. However, the requirement that you be built above the floodplain, and therefore it could be solved either by displacing people or by putting buildings on stilts or by raising the land, options that have been used successfully many, many times, are also being rejected because of the quote, sudden cost, the fact that they will folks will now be required to pay a lot more of the freight for insurance, which they had benefited from inappropriately, in my opinion. Okay? So there's not, you talk about long-term changes, they're not even willing to accept the short-term, immediate costs, and I don't think it has anything to do with rationality, it has to do with behavioral issues of fundamental belief sets, I don't mean a religious sense, but cultural belief sets, as you pointed out. So it seems to be following this gentleman's question. If you look at people moving to situations that could be very adverse, let's say moving to Delhi from the countryside, where, or the Lower East Side of New York in the last century, right? People think that whatever it is they're getting is going to be better than whatever it is they're leaving. Mm-hmm. And so you have mass migrations that were driven by presumed opportunity rather than the concerns, which seem very paternalistic about how many folks are going to die in a given catastrophe. When you know, I can be too cynical, but as Stalin said, one person dies, it's a tragedy, a million dies, it's a statistic. And that's really how the whole system works. So, but they're not willing to accept even gradual changes.
I think you're very right to point out the responsibility of governments. I mean, in the case of Sandy that you just recalled, it was, in the first place, the responsibility of local governments to accept that people would settle in these areas. And you're also very right to say that the condition for a migration to work, for a resettlement scheme to work, is that the people need to know that what they're getting is better than what they're leaving. And that is the responsibility of the government to ensure that there would be appropriate, I think so, that there would be appropriate housing and new job opportunities so that the people would get a better livelihood than the one they're leaving.
It is not the responsibility of the government.
I think it is.
Okay.
So,
if we have just another minute, could you comment on your understanding of where loss and damage fits right now into the climate negotiations and what its prospects are, or where conversations are on that?
Sure, maybe a quick one on what loss and damage is. So loss and damage appeared in the international negotiations on climate change, I would say, 4 or 5 years ago maybe, and was formalized in Warsaw in the latest round, before the latest round of negotiations in 2013. It is the idea that it will be impossible to adapt to some impacts of climate change, and that for these impacts where adaptation will be impossible, there will be a need for financial compensation for the loss and damage resulting from these impacts. I would say that, in a way, the fact that we're discussing about loss and damage is an admission that adaptation will not allow us to minimize all impacts, and that there are some limits to adaptation. And I would say that it is, I'm afraid that we're on a kind of slippery slope here, because adaptation in the first place was an admission that mitigation had its limits. And loss and damage is another admission that adaptation has its limits. So the question that I would ask now is, what would be the next step after loss and damage? That might be something like geoengineering or population engineering. So this is where it fits in the negotiation at the moment. There is a general acceptance of the principle. The problem is, of course, who is willing to pay, and at the moment industrialized countries are unwilling to accept a direct linkage between the impacts of climate change and their financial responsibility, of course.
Just a small comment. I thought an interesting compromise was made in the state of North Carolina, where you can get insurance paid for the loss of the house once.
Yep.
And never again. So it was a political decision, which I thought was pretty clever, given all the factors, complications involved.
See, the responsibility of governments.
Yeah, right.